And now we are done at differentiating and describing the types of qualitative and quantitative research. Let's move on to the methods and deciding the appropriate type of research to be used in collecting and gathering data. Research methods are specific procedures for collecting and analyzing data. Developing the research methods is an integral part of the research design. When planning your methods, there are two key decisions you will make. First is decide how you will collect data. Your method depends on what type of data you need to answer your research question. May it be qualitative versus quantitative. Will your data take the form of words or numbers? Primary versus secondary. Will you collect original data yourself or you will use data that has already been collected by someone else? Descriptive versus experimental. Will you take measurements of something as it is or will you perform an experiment? Second, decide how you will analyze the data. For quantitative data, you can use statistical analysis method to test the relationship between variables. For qualitative data, you can use methods such as thematic analysis to interpret patterns and meanings in the data. Data is the information that are collected for the purpose of answering your research question. The type of data you need depends on the aims of your research. For questions about ideas, experiences, and meanings, or to study something that can't be described numerically, collect qualitative data. If you want to develop a more mechanistic understanding of a topic or your research involves hypothesis testing, collect quantitative data. So here are the pros and cons of collecting qualitative and quantitative data. For the qualitative pros, it is flexible. You can often adjust your methods as you go to develop new knowledge. It also can be conducted with small samples. For qualitative cons, can't be analyzed statistically or generalized to broader population, and it is difficult to standardize research. For quantitative pros, it can be used to systematically describe large collection of things, and it can generate producible knowledge. For the cons, it requires statistical training to analyze data. It also requires larger samples, and you can also take a mixed method approach where you use both qualitative and quantitative research methods. Now let's move on to primary and secondary data. Primary data is any original information that you collect for the purpose of answering your research question. For example, through survey, observation, and experiments. Secondary data is information that has already been collected by other researchers, for example, in government census or previous scientific studies. If you are exploring a novel research question, you'll probably need to collect primary data. But if you want to synthesize existing knowledge, analyze historical trends, or identify patterns on a large scale, secondary data might be a better choice. And here are also the primary data and secondary data pros and cons. For the primary data pros, it can be collected to answer your specific research question, and you have a control over a sampling and measurement methods. For the primary data cons, more expensive and time-consuming to collect, and it requires training in data collection methods. For secondary pros, it is easier and faster to access. You can collect data that spans longer time scale and broader geographical location. For its cons, you have no control over how data was generated, and it requires extra processing to make sure it works for your analysis. Now let's move forward to descriptive versus experimental data. In descriptive research, you collect data about your study subject without intervening. The validity of your research will depend on your sampling method. In experimental research, you systematically intervene in a process and measure the outcome. The validity of your research will depend on your experimental design. To conduct an experiment, you need to be able to vary your dependent variable, precisely measure your dependent variables, and control for confounding variables. If it is practically and ethically possible, this method is the best choice for answering questions about cause and effect. And here are the pros and cons of descriptive and experimental data. For descriptive pros, it allows you to describe your research subject without influencing it, and it is accessible. You can gather more data on a large scale. For its cons, you have no control over confounding variables, and it can't establish cause and effect relationship. For experimental data, its pros are you have more control over confounding variables, and you can establish cause and effect relationship. For its cons, you might influence your research subject in unexpected ways, and it usually requires more expertise and resource to collect data. And here are the examples of research method for collecting data. When you are performing an experiment, you want to test the cause and effect relationship. So the data that you need is a primary data and quantitative research. When you are performing a survey, to understand the general characteristic of a population, you need a primary data and a quantitative research. For interview or focus group, to gain more in-depth understanding of a topic, you need to use primary data and qualitative research. When you are collecting data through observation, you need to understand how something occurs in its natural settings. You need to use primary data. And when using the research, it's either qualitative or quantitative. When you opt to collect data on literature review, to situate your research in an existing body of work, or to evaluate trends with a research topic, you will use secondary. And it's either qualitative or quantitative research. When you are performing a case study to gain an in-depth understanding of a specific group or context, or when you don't have the resource for a large studies, you will use either the primary or the secondary, and either qualitative or quantitative. And when you are doing a statistical analysis to analyze data in a statistical valid manner, for example, experiments, surveys, and observation, you will use quantitative data. For meta-analysis, to statistically analyze the result of a large collection of studies, you will use quantitative data. Can only be applied to studies that collected data in statistical valid manner. And when you want to collect thematic analysis, to analyze data collected from interviews, focus group, or textual sources, or to understand general themes in the data and how they are connected, you will use qualitative research. And lastly, for content analysis, to analyze the large volume of textual or visual data collected from surveys, literature reviews, or other resources, you can use qualitative or quantitative research. Your choice of quantitative or qualitative data collection depends on the type of knowledge you want to develop. Take note, your data analysis methods will depend on the type of data you collect and how you prepare it for analysis. Thank you.